As veganism has grown over the last few years, so too have the number of ex-vegans and people generally claiming that meat eating is good for them and moral and ethical as well. So we're going to jump into that today, and I'm going to go over some of the most common arguments and justifications for eating meat and give you my take on the ethics of eating meat in the year 2020. Hi, I'm Serena and I've been vegan since birth. Welcome to my channel where I talk about the what, whys, and hows of veganism and answer all of your questions. Having attended a private liberal arts college and been doing vegan activism for years, I've heard practically every argument on the block for eating meat and the ethics of it, and let me tell you, there are some really bizarre claims out there. But make sure you watch all the way through to the end of this video where I will share a story with you about one of the strangest experiences and justifications I've ever heard for eating meat. So before we jump into the video today and actually discuss the various arguments and their merits for eating meat, I want to lay a few things out. The first is, I'm going to assume that you and I both want to see less violence in this world, more peace, less suffering, and less death. I'm also going to assume that we can agree that killing humans is generally wrong and that we should avoid it and avoid murdering them as much as possible, except in, of course, situations of self-defense. But generally, we agree that killing humans is bad, murdering is bad, and we want to avoid that and lessen the number of deaths of humans that are going on. And finally, I'm going to assume that we can agree when society progresses morally and ethically, that's a good thing. And it's good that we have left off practices in our past that are unethical and problematic as we view them today, and that society is not at an ideal place, and we can probably continue to improve and create a more just and peaceful society for all beings, and something that we both want. Great, now that we've got that out of the way, I know that we're at least starting on the same page here, because if you do not agree with these things, then I'm going to make the assumption that we really have very different ethics and morals that we follow, and this video probably isn't for you, and feel free to click away. So there are two primary ways today, in the very strange year of 2020, to obtain meat. And the first of those is breeding animals into existence, raising them on a farm or in some sort of ranch or other operation, and then killing them to produce meat. The second is hunting, basically going out, seeking out free-living wild animals that were naturally in existence, and then killing them and consuming their flesh. I'm going to be focusing primarily today on the predominant way that most people get their meat, which is the breeding animals into existence to kill them kind, although many of the arguments I will make when it comes to death and ethics also apply to hunting. I'm not going to be going into the actual details and a lot more of the arguments that come up around hunting and conservation. Likewise, I am also not going to be talking about lab-grown meat, which I have made some videos in the past about if you'd like to check those out, and I'm going to be sticking to meat that comes from killing an animal. Because right here, right now, unless you are eating something like roadkill, the meat that you are eating came from an animal that was intentionally killed for the consumption of their flesh. So if eating meat can be ethical, then we have to morally justify both raising and bringing an animal into existence just to consume their flesh and taking the life intentionally of a living, breathing, sentient being that is aware, can feel pain, and suffer. Now, over the years, I have heard a lot of justifications for both of these, but they tend to fall into two main categories. The first of which is this idea that something is natural and therefore it is justified. And the second of which is the necessary, right? So it's necessary for survival, it's necessary for us to do this for health, for whatever. I will kind of address some that are a little bit outside of that, but we're gonna start by looking at the natural claims. These are the responses you have maybe heard or thought along the lines of, well, our ancestors did this. We were biologically designed to eat meat. Animals eat other animals. It's part of the food chain. This is what we've always done, and so on, and so on, and so on. However, something being natural is really not a good justification for continuing to do that practice today. If we take the natural excuse to heart, well, then animals behave in all kinds of ways in the animal kingdom that we don't look at and do. They lick each other to clean themselves. They, around nude. And this one may be a little bit more controversial, but it's also true that in the wild, in nature, among other animals, things like rape and sexual assault, especially of the females among many species, is incredibly natural. And it's also natural among our ancestors and something that has been part of our culture for generations. So using natural as a justification for our behavior would mean that things like rape and sexual assault are perfectly fine because they are natural and exist in nature and throughout human history. If we really cared about living a natural life, I wouldn't be talking to you via my camera and technology. We wouldn't have internet, we wouldn't be living in homes and driving cars and flying. None of these things are natural that other animals or our ancestors have done. Yet, I think most of us recognize that we aren't trying to live exactly as our ancestors did or as other animals do in nature today. Similarly, I have frequently heard the argument that eating meat is what actually made us human. It grew our brains, it made us special, that's why we can think and build these cities and use weapons. And I'm going to dispute the science on that, and that is not actually the case. But even if it was true, even if eating meat did help us survive in the past, even if eating meat did grow our brain size, help make us human and who we are today, that doesn't mean we have to keep doing it. Something being done in the past, or what we used to do, or what used to be necessary, says nothing about what is necessary and important for us to do today. And as rational individuals with brains that can think and can make decisions about what is the most ethical decision to do moving forward, we can see that we don't need to kill animals. We don't need to eat meat right here, right now, to live a happy and healthy life. But anyway, that brings me to the necessary claims. And these take on a little bit of a different tone, but these can range anything from, of course, the health argument, right? I need meat to be healthy. I can't survive without meat or animal protein. I have a lot of food sensitivities or other, things I can't eat, so I need to eat meat. People in other countries, this gets brought up a lot, right? Like people in other countries that depend on meat in developing nations, or even more commonly now is this idea of access to healthy food and produce and food deserts. And that not everyone, even here in America, has equal access or ability to cut animal products out of their diet and still thrive. And then lastly, kind of the one that falls into this group, it's a little bit different, but it's the idea that meat is necessary and a crucial part of many individuals' cultures, specifically indigenous communities that have been eating meat in a more, humane or reverent way for generations. And so that we shouldn't tell them not to do that because that's a really important piece of their culture. So I will say that I 100% agree that there absolutely are situations where it is very difficult or near impossible for people to cut meat out of their diet. However, I think these are incredibly overblown situations, and that most of the health claims that come up around veganism are honestly absolutely ridiculous. Things like FODMAP or celiac disease or food sensitivities or Crohn's disease are not scientifically valid reasons to be unable to eat a vegan diet or to cut meat out of your diet. I personally am gluten-free. I know many people that continue to be vegan even while dealing with other food issues and sensitivities. I know people that have improved on dealing with things like their Crohn's disease by cutting meat out of their diet and eating more fiber. There is no special nutrient in meat that one cannot get from other sources to be able to thrive without actually eating animal tissue. Now, if you are one of these people in some very rare situations or circumstances, or if you really don't have access to adequate food, then of course, I do understand, and maybe this video isn't for you. But even if you are one of those people, we can still agree that eating meat is unethical, and that ideally we would change those circumstances, or eventually you would get to a place where you are able to cut meat out. So agreeing that meat is unethical is not precluded even if you're one of these people in a situation where you really can't survive without eating animal products. The majority of the time, like 99% of the time that I am talking with people who bring up either cost or access or people in other countries, they are people that absolutely have the ability and access I remember this really funny conversation. I was on the street one time, and someone came up to me and goes, "I'm a school teacher, so I absolutely can't afford to be vegan." And she actually told me her salary on the spot, as though, that precluded her from cutting meat out. And I looked at her and I said, "Hey, guess what? I'm also a school teacher, and wow, actually I make less than you do, and I'm vegan just fine." So, and I don't mean to be claiming that people aren't trying hard enough, but the reality is that most people bring these things up as excuses because they don't want to be vegan or they don't want to cut out meat or other animal products. It's not really because they don't have access or they can't afford it, or, bringing up other people as a distraction, right? Like, don't bring up people in another country if you personally have the ability to cut meat out. We can make moral exceptions, right? Like, we can recognize that someone who's maybe starving and steals a loaf of bread or vegetables from a market to feed their family. Personally, I'm gonna look at that and I'm gonna say, I completely understand that we should make an ethical exception for this. They were doing it to survive, they were starving, they didn't have money, this was their only option. But I don't extend that and say, therefore, everyone should be able to steal all the time in other circumstances. Generally, I think that stealing is still wrong, but we should fix the circumstances that allowed someone to be in poverty and be unable to feed themselves in the first place. And I think that's the same way it goes with cutting meat out and the ethics of consuming flesh today. So even if you are in these situations where we sit here and we go, I'm gonna make an exception for you, right? And I actually met someone who was homeless and vegan once, which we don't want to erase those people as well. But I understand, obviously, if you are homeless, it is a lot more difficult and you may be pretty unable to decide truly what you are eating one way or the other. So I'm not gonna go and talk to homeless people and be like, you need to go vegan, you need to cut meat out. Like, that's just dumb. But other people bringing that up as an excuse for them not to go vegan is equally just as absurd. Now, the indigenous culture, or just the general culture argument, is a little bit different from need and necessity. But it basically claims that eating meat is so central to one's culture that it's necessary to maintain their cultural practices, and that giving it up will, destroy some portion of their culture or be harmful in some way. And therefore, continuing to eat meat is both ethical and justified. However, when it comes to things like, comparably, human rights, we clearly do not see culture as a justification. Things like child marriage, female genital mutilation, and even rape and incest and selling one's children, all of these things are actually practices that are still acceptable and integral of several cultures around the world. Yet most human rights activists and advocates I know don't sit there and say, well, that's fine, that's part of their culture, so we're not going to address that. Rather, they stand up and they're still able to say, objectively speaking, these practices are unethical, immoral, and wrong, and it being part of one's culture or not does not make it justified or acceptable. So, now that we have covered both of the main categories that the majority of justifications for ethically eating meat fall into, I want to talk about one that's a little bit different. And this is the idea that death itself really isn't a harm. Most people I've talked to who believe that it is totally ethical to eat meat already agree with me that, say, factory farming is bad and that abusing animals is wrong and that unnecessary torture or there are these other problematic practices, that all of that is wrong. And many of them agree that our meat system as it is today is largely horrific and wrong, but that, having a small family farm and treating your animals really well and truly giving them a good life, that then there's nothing wrong with that at the end of their life or when they get old, then killing them and consuming their flesh, if they are killed in a quick and painless and humane way. A similar idea is reflected in something that people like Temple Grandin, who is a proponent of humane slaughter, suggests when she said something along the lines of, these animals wouldn't even exist if we weren't breeding them into existence and giving them life before we kill them and take their life, right? So therefore, we are providing them with life in the first place, so that makes killing them and their utility to us ethical in the end. Back to the idea of humane slaughter, and yes, I always put quotes around it because I don't believe there's such a thing. But basically, right, is it humane? Is it ethical if we give an animal a long, happy life and then we try to kill them as painlessly as possible at the end? Is that ethical? And I'm going to say this once and only once. There is no humane way to kill someone who wants to live, period. Just, like, that's it. And if you disagree with me, then I would ask you this. Tell me, what method of slaughter do you consider humane that if I were to walk up to you today and against your will end your life because, well, you've had a good 20 years on the planet or a good 50 years on the planet, right? You've had life this whole time. If I were to use that method, whether it is gassing or stunning or having your throat slit or the various methods that are used in meat production today, would you be okay with it? If I came up to you and was like, okay, time's up on this planet, I'm gonna slit your throat, then would you be fine with me doing that? And if you think that is wrong, then clearly you understand that it is wrong to do the same to animals. Now, I know that the common theme that comes up is people will say, well, what about euthanasia, right? Like we take our cats and dogs or our pets that we have loved dearly, when they're getting old and suffering, we take them to be put down. So, you know, there's humane killing, right? And there's a couple key differences here. One, we aren't doing that for ourselves. We are doing that because we really believe that they don't want to be suffering and in pain. The truth is, we honestly don't know what they want in these situations. And I haven't had to make that decision before, and honestly, I don't know what I'd do. It's a very hard and difficult decision, and I'm not sure that if animals could speak, that they would really tell us this. And then, of course, you know, we can get into human euthanasia and all that. But the key difference here is we are doing this when we think it is truly in an animal's best interest, for them, not us, and we are using what most people deem as the most harmless, painless way to be killed, and that is using, you know, injectable euthanasia drugs. Of course, you know, we won't get into the death penalty shade, but sometimes even human euthanasia drugs go incredibly wrong and they are not painless at all. So I'm sure the same probably happens with animals too. But that said, we consider that sort of the ultimate humane standard of killing another individual. But we can't do that with the animals that are being slaughtered for meat consumption because those drugs would then get into their bloodstream and make the meat basically dangerous for humans to eat. So instead, we basically have to slit animals' throats. And that is pretty horrific. And I don't think even if it's, 1 minute, even if it takes 2 minutes, 30 seconds, those are 30 seconds of the most atrocious suffering, pain, horror, abuse. Like, that's pretty horrific. And so again, if you think it's not, then I guess you're okay with someone doing that to you against their will. But, you know, fundamentally, right, it comes back to there's really no way to do this humanely when an animal wants to live. When they are perfectly happy and healthy, not injured, not dying, not in pain or suffering, right? And they don't want to die. Animals have the same will to live that all of us do as well. But the last story I want to tell here is one of the most ridiculous comments I think I've ever heard on this topic. I was actually at a meeting with some local city commissioners. Our city had just passed an ordinance basically allowing backyard slaughter of small animals, I believe chickens, ducks, maybe even like goats, inside the city limits of my town. And we were at this meeting with a bunch of other people. My family and I were there, and we were asking some questions. And basically the topic of humane slaughter was coming up, and I asked the audience and the commissioners there, I said, is there a humane way to kill someone that wants to live? And this woman in the audience, who was clearly a farmer and killing animals herself, turned around and looked at me and says, yes, absolutely. Gassing is the most humane method. I was really taken aback. I was amazed that she just came out and said that. Well, it gets even worse. So then I said, okay, so, and right, gassing of all things to consider humane, what does gassing make you think of in history, right, as a method of killing? But moving on. And so I looked at her and I said, so would you be okay with someone gassing you to death right now? She turns around and she goes, yes, absolutely. I think about euthanasia all the time. We are too afraid of death as a society. And that was just like, I was totally stunned. And yet that is the level of, consistency that some people are trying to go to. So I would also ask you this. Do you agree? If you're gonna sit here and tell me that gassing is a method of humane slaughter, then are you perfectly fine with being killed? Because there's a very big difference between choosing euthanasia as a method to go at the end of your life after you've lived a long, happy life, and someone else killing and murdering you against your will because they want to consume your flesh. Ultimately, the question is, if we can live happy and healthy lives without harming others and without killing other living beings, why not do so? If we truly care about peace and justice and nonviolence, if we want to see less death, if we want to see a more socially just society and continue to leave off harmful things that are going on around us, then why not live without killing others? It's really that simple. So I hope you enjoyed this video. That is my take on the ethics of eating meat. And give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and leave me a comment below. Tell me, did I miss some arguments? What are some arguments you'd like me to address? And what do you think about whether or not it is ethical to eat meat in 2020? All right, I will see you next week.